I spent the entire day cleaning the house and ironing Matthew's shirts. After the lunch, I started preparing his favorite dish, chicken cordon bleu stuffed with cheese and ham. For dessert, I made his beloved raspberry cheesecake. It turned out perfectly. I've always made an effort to look my best. You'd never catch me at home with uncombed hair or no makeup. I wanted to please Matthew, keep him focused on positive emotions, and ensure he didn't look at other women. After showering, I sat in front of the mirror to style my hair and apply some light makeup. Slipping into a form-fitting outfit, I looked like an attractive, fresh-faced housewife. I hoped it would help ease the tension that had been building in our relationship lately. Matthew had been irritable, frequently exploding over trivial matters. At 7 p.m. sharp, Matthew arrived home. He tossed his briefcase in the entryway and headed for the kitchen. I'd set the table beautifully, with a bottle of crisp wine already open. I rushed to greet him with a hug. I warmly welcomed him home and asked how he was feeling. I told him I'd made his favorite dinner as a treat and suggested he wash up and come to the table, as everything was ready. Matthew reluctantly kissed me, frowning as if displeased by the surprise. It stung to see his reaction after I'd worked so hard and waited eagerly for his return. We sat down to eat. Matthew chewed lazily and drank the wine, but seemed unsatisfied. He gruffly asked what we were celebrating, complaining that business was terrible. He said sales were down and income would soon decrease. Matthew angrily tossed a file of reports and graphs onto the table. I glanced at them. The situation did look dire. Cautiously, I asked why he had rejected some reliable suppliers who offered quality materials at good prices. That's when the trouble really started. Matthew shouted, asking if I was calling him a bad manager who couldn't run the clothing factory without me. His sarcastic, "Thanks for your support," cut deep. Confused, I tried to explain I was just commenting on what I saw in the reports, nothing more. I asked why he was getting angry over something so small. I was tired too, I told him. I'd stayed home as he wanted, waiting for him, cooking, missing him. Yet he came home and lashed out at me. Fighting back tears, I pleaded with him to talk to me, to help me understand what was really going on. I told him I could see how he'd changed, even turning his back to the wall when we slept. I asked if he was just tired, or if there was something else. With his frequent weekend business trips, I had to know, was there another woman? I stared into Matthew's eyes, expecting him to make a joke or tell me not to be silly. But what happened next shocked me to my core. Matthew drained his wine glass and leapt up from his chair towards me. With wild eyes and clenched fists, he shouted that yes, he did have a mistress he truly loved. He said he'd been sick of me for a long time. His cruel words came in a torrent. He called me useless in bed, said I only talked about food and plants. He sneered that I was an inferior, barren woman who couldn't even get pregnant. Matthew declared he was divorcing me immediately so he could have his own children. He no longer needed me, he spat, and told me to pack my bags and get out. I was stunned, unable to believe what was happening. I begged Matthew to calm down, reminding him this was our home. Where was I supposed to go? We'd been together for years, how could he want to erase all of that? Desperately, I told him I believed we could still have children, that I just had all the tests done. But Matthew wouldn't listen. He kept ranting that he didn't care about tests, that he would soon be a father and start a new, happy life. Matthew coldly informed me to forget about the house, it was all in his name. Our joint bank accounts and savings would be blocked immediately. He sneered that I was used to living off his money and told me to figure things out on my own. His hurtful tirade continued. Matthew said he didn't want my cooking or my plants anymore. He wanted passion and drive, he shouted. Why did he even marry me? He shouldn't have listened to his mother, he lamented. He had wasted so many years, he complained. Sobbing, I packed a suitcase with some clothes, documents, and essentials. With little cash in my wallet, I could only afford a cheap hotel room. I had no idea what I would do next. I prayed Matthew would calm down so we could have a normal conversation. Lying on the bed in that lonely room, I wept as memories of my life with Matthew washed over me. How had things gone so terribly wrong? I always knew my mother was special. She focused on her studies when she was young and only decided to have a child when she was nearly 40. That's why she cherished me, her only daughter, so much. We lived in a beautiful apartment in the heart of Chicago, surrounded by love and kindness. My parents instilled in me a love for learning and an appreciation for beauty. They had an extensive library, which I adored. I excelled in my studies and easily got into college, but I chose to live at home rather than in a dorm. I had one close friend, Andrea, who came from a broken home and lived in challenging circumstances. I could sense that she envied me, though I never fully understood why at the time. Andrea would often say to me, "You're so lucky, Lexi. You've had everything since childhood." She'd speculate that my father must have pulled strings to get me into college. "You have a beautiful home and never worry about money," she'd continue. "Live happily, don't be like me." When I was a child, my father would beat me and my mother with a stick. We often didn't have enough to eat. Andrea would then declare her intentions to find a job and a wealthy boyfriend so she could live like me. I was a dreamer, shy, and polite, while Andrea was outgoing and direct. Despite our differences, we found common ground and became friends. Sometimes I'd invite Andrea over, but I could tell my parents didn't approve. Andrea would try on all my clothes and often ask for things. After she left, my mother would scold me. "You shouldn't be friends with someone like that," she warned. "Andrea would easily steal your fiancé, not to mention your belongings. Can't you see the greed and envy in her eyes?" But in my innocence, I argued back. "Yes, Andrea might not have learned good manners, but that's because of her tough childhood," I tried to explain. "Don't you see? My friend isn't a bad person at all. She's cheerful and loyal." I'd remind my mother how Andrea had protected me from bullies. "I feel safe when I'm with Andrea," I'd insist. After receiving my diploma, I rushed home, knowing my parents would be waiting to celebrate. But when I saw the doctor's car near our entrance, I felt a painful twinge in my chest. My premonition wasn't wrong. "Something terrible has happened," I was told. "Your mother was cutting salad, waiting for you." Then she collapsed on the floor. It was terrifying, and we couldn't bring her back to consciousness. I prayed that my mother was still alive, that everything would be okay. I couldn't imagine life without the woman I'd lived with all my life. But miracles don't always happen. After a week in intensive care, my mother passed away from a stroke. I had to become an adult overnight. My father was completely devastated, talking to her as if she were still alive. His mind seemed to have gone blank. During this difficult time, Matthew's parents came to help our family. They assisted me in arranging the funeral, and their son Matthew was there too. The young Matthew tried to support me in a friendly way, and we talked a lot. After the funeral, Matthew's father offered me a job. "There's no need to stay at home crying anymore," he said. "You're the head of the family now. Your father has lost his senses completely. Come to our garment factory. It's a family business, and Matthew already works there. He'll teach you everything and bring you up to speed. It's easier to bear grief when your mind is occupied." I agreed, feeling lost and unsure how to continue living. I started working as a purchasing manager in my area of expertise. At first, I was shy and timid, but soon I got used to it, and things started going well. Matthew was already a supervisor and involved in his father's work. Matthew's parents encouraged him to marry me. "Son, look at Lexi," they'd say. "She's a good girl. Humble, educated, from a decent family. You two would make a lovely couple. We're sure of it." So we started dating and eventually had a grand wedding. We lived happily together. Matthew was kind, never yelled, and cherished the warmth of family life. My father only lived for 3 years after my mother's death, quietly departing to heaven to join her. I mourned deeply for my loved ones. After my father's death, Matthew convinced me to sell my parents' apartment. We added our own money and bought a house, thinking it would be more suitable when we had children. As I reflect on my life's journey, I'm struck by how quickly everything changed. The loss of my parents was devastating, but I found strength I didn't know I had. Matthew and his family became my rock, offering support when I needed it most. I often wonder what my mother would think of the woman I've become. Would she be proud of how I've handled the challenges life has thrown my way? I hope she would be. There are days when I still feel Andrea's words echoing in my mind about how lucky I was. But now I understand that true wealth isn't just about material possessions. It's about the love and support of family, the strength to overcome adversity, and the ability to find happiness in life's simple moments. As I looked towards the future with Matthew, I was filled with a mix of emotions, hope, excitement, and a touch of apprehension. But I believed that whatever comes our way, we would face it together, just as my parents taught me to do. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be blessed with a child of our own someday, to whom we can pass on the values and love that my parents so generously shared with me. Years passed, but the longed-for pregnancy never came. I underwent tests, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with me. They suggested Matthew should get tested too, but he refused, blaming our infertility on me. It wasn't until recently that he finally agreed to be tested, but we were still waiting for the results. By this time, Matthew was running the factory, and I had become a full-time housewife. I used to help at the factory, but Matthew had insisted I stay at home. Our relationship had gradually cooled over time. Even though we didn't have children, I never imagined Matthew would cheat on me and try to divorce me without leaving me anything. In my desperation, I decided to call my friend. "Andrea," I choked out, "I'm at a hotel. Please come. Something has happened. My life is falling apart before my eyes. I don't know what to do." Andrea responded immediately, telling me not to be scared, that she was on her way, and that we'd figure something out together. Now, as we sat drinking, I poured out my story to her. "Andrea, how could Matthew do this to me? He's been sleeping with someone behind my back for over a year. What kind of horrible women are out there? Matthew's lost his mind. He's blocked my cards and bank accounts, and now I have nothing left. He says this woman is going to have a baby soon. Because I couldn't have children, my husband doesn't need me anymore. I'm so hurt. After living together for so long, Matthew is throwing me out of his life like I'm some useless old thing. What am I supposed to do?" Andrea sighed and shook her head in sympathy. She told me Matthew was a terrible man, and that no one could have predicted this. She said it was bad enough that he decided to cheat and leave, but it was downright unmanly to leave me without any money. Andrea told me not to cry, that tears wouldn't help, and that I shouldn't give up. She insisted I needed to defend my rights and suggested we find a good lawyer. She said she knew just the person, an excellent specialist in family issues and property division named Bruce. Andrea offered to help me prepare all the documents and make the appointment. Through my tears, I thanked Andrea, agreeing it was a good idea. But I worried aloud about how I could afford a lawyer's services. Without hesitation, my friend pulled out her wallet and handed me a wad of bills. She told me to take it and pay her back later, assuring me she wouldn't abandon me and that we'd figure it out together. Andrea encouraged me to keep fighting and believe everything would work out, promising she'd always support me. I hugged my friend and whispered my thanks, acknowledging that she was the best friend in the world. I admitted that maybe she was right, I shouldn't be so sad. After all, I reflected, life always presents challenges, and those who endure them become the victors. The next day, I met with the lawyer. He was a very serious man who made a good impression on me. He listened carefully to everything, made copies of the documents, and promised to take the case. This gave me hope, at least I might have a roof over my head. Now, it was time to search for a way forward. I knew Matthew wouldn't change his mind, so I had to learn how to survive on my own. My husband kept harassing me over the phone, threatening that I wouldn't be satisfied with the court's decision and that he had every chance of winning the case. It felt like Matthew was trying to kill me mentally. My condition was terrible, and I was just waiting for the lawyer's help. Andrea was calling to support me during this difficult time. But if only I knew what was really happening. It was as if a nest of rattlesnakes had tangled into one knot, preparing to bite me to death. Meanwhile, at the law firm, the tension was boiling over. The most popular and highest-paid lawyer in town was pacing around the office, vividly describing how he would make Matthew's wife leave the courtroom with nothing. The man gestured energetically as he explained his strategy. He boasted about finding the perfect combination and how fighting on two fronts would be highly profitable. He pointed out how I now trusted him unconditionally and had given him copies of all the documents. The lawyer revealed that I was claiming Matthew had insisted on selling my parents' apartment and investing that money in the house where we lived. He acknowledged that this was true and there was evidence, but he and Matthew would prove that Matthew had put up the other half of the money. He also mentioned the renovations and furniture being Matthew's expense, implying the house already belonged more to Matthew than to me. But that wasn't all. The lawyer bragged about using his connections to bribe suitable witnesses. He said they could easily prove that I hadn't worked anywhere for 5 years and that Matthew had been supporting me. He even claimed they would show I had led a dissolute life, frequently drinking, and that Matthew had spent a lot of money on my treatment at a clinic. The lawyer assured Matthew that the judge was an old debtor of his, so the case was as good as won. He promised to make Matthew's wife leave with nothing and told him not to worry about Andrea, as he had arranged for no one to be able to prove anything. He concluded by saying everyone would sympathize with Matthew. Matthew was elated, feeling everything was going perfectly. Andrea sat in an armchair, boasting for a while. She gloated about how I, her poor friend, had come crying to her for help. She asked rhetorically what she had done, answering that she had done what she should and helped me. Andrea smirked, saying I believed she was on my side, calling me an innocent child. She revealed that I didn't even know she was the woman trying to have a baby with Matthew. Andrea expressed her satisfaction, saying the important thing was that their plan wouldn't be exposed before the trial. She looked forward to finally being happy with Matthew and having a baby soon. Janet, pretending to be working hard, was reviewing some documents for the umpteenth time, but she was amazed at the lawyer's cunning plot. The man was her idol, and she dreamed of learning from his experience and winning cases spectacularly. But now, seeing the lawyer's double face, how he brazenly lied to me and tried to trap me into leaving with nothing, the young woman was deeply shocked by her mentor. Janet couldn't stand treachery since she was a little girl. She always stood up for those unfairly hurt and sought the truth. That's why she chose this profession. Janet waited for everyone to leave, found my contact information, and decided to reveal the whole truth to me. She knew she'd lose her job, but she was outraged by Matthew's audacity and the lawyer's confidence in his impunity. We agreed to meet at the hotel where I was staying. There was a cozy cafe there, not too crowded, where we could talk quietly. I arrived at the meeting place completely confused. What could Janet want? But Janet was determined and started with the important stuff. She told me she worked at Bruce's law firm, sitting in the same office as him. She said she had witnessed a meeting between Bruce and my husband that day and was very upset. Janet revealed that Bruce wasn't planning to defend my rights, but to do the exact opposite. She understood this truth would surprise me but felt she couldn't keep it to herself. She said it was unfair that everyone was against me. I blinked several times, unable to speak. Wait, is this a joke? I finally managed to say. It can't be. I don't believe it. Andrea wouldn't do that. We've been friends since childhood. I've done so much for her. A friend wouldn't betray me like this. Andrea introduced me to the lawyer and even gave me money. Just then, my cell phone rang. Distracted, I answered, yes, my husband and I took the tests. What? Can you send the results to my email? I hung up and suddenly started laughing hysterically, tears streaming down my face. Janet realized this was a sign of extreme mental fatigue. So instead of trying to calm me down, she just splashed water on my face and helped me. I moaned, seeming to come to my senses. Janet started apologizing, saying she didn't mean to hurt me, but I was hysterical. She asked what else had happened. I wiped my face with a tissue and said, "You may not believe this, but I just found out the reason my husband left me is that his mistress is pregnant. Now I'm wondering who's pregnant and whose child it is. He always blamed me for not being able to have a baby. How can I not be hysterical?" Janet thought for a moment. She said it was good that everything was clear now. She suggested I could go to my husband and threaten him, thinking he might change his mind about the case. Janet offered to defend me in court for free if I wanted, but warned we'd probably lose because Bruce and the corrupt judge had planned everything. But she said she had a plan. Stunned, I stared at Janet, not knowing what to do. I had blindly trusted Bruce, who seemed so trustworthy. I thought to myself, I have no ability to judge people. First my husband lied to me, and now the lawyer. I don't know how to trust anyone. After some hesitation, I eventually agreed. "Okay," I said. "Let's try to do something together. Thank you for telling me everything and risking your career. Tomorrow, I'll cancel my contract with Bruce and take my money and copies of the documents. It might be too late, but..." Janet told me not to despair prematurely. She said she'd contact me as soon as she thought of how we should act. She advised me to try to calm down a bit, saying we needed a cool head to win this difficult battle. The next day, I went to see Bruce and canceled the contract. Bruce was stunned. He asked what had happened, saying we had a great chance of winning the case. He reminded me I had already paid and that he couldn't give a refund. He asked if I was doubting his perfect reputation. I replied curtly, "I'm sorry, but I've changed my mind. It's my right. I don't need a lawyer." Bruce didn't get angry. This suited him fine. He had gotten the money and didn't have to do anything. However, when Janet wrote her resignation letter the same day, Bruce was perplexed. The man tried to persuade her to stay. I felt a mix of emotions, relief at knowing the truth, fear for what was to come, and gratitude towards Janet for her bravery. As I left Bruce's office, I couldn't help but wonder what my next move should be. The weight of everything, Matthew's betrayal, Andrea's deceit, and now this legal nightmare, felt overwhelming. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer the naive, trusting woman I had been just days ago. I was ready to fight for what was rightfully mine, no matter the cost. Janet had great potential and would undoubtedly become a competent lawyer. However, she used family circumstances and an urgent move as an excuse to leave. I could sense that Bruce intuitively felt something was happening. There had to be a reason for these coincidences occurring on the same day, but he couldn't understand it yet. Now that Janet was free, she decided to follow Andrea. On the third day, she saw what she wanted to see. Andrea, who was supposedly in love with Matthew, had another lover, a young fitness trainer. They were passionately kissing in a car, oblivious to their surroundings. Janet managed to take some good photos. It took another week to gather documents for the court, and finally, Janet called me. She told me to meet her at the same cafe the next day, saying we'd go to my husband's house, which was still my house too. She said she had a plan and would explain everything when we met. When we met, I anxiously asked Janet if we should really go to Matthew's house. I wondered what the point was, with the trial just 3 days away. But Janet disagreed. She explained that with the trial so close, Bruce had prepared strong evidence to give us no chance. Janet told me I couldn't win this trial, but assured me she knew what she was saying. She wanted to surprise Matthew at home, certain he wouldn't be alone but with his mistress. Janet hoped to threaten my husband into giving up everything, saying it was our only chance. I shook my head, feeling uncertain. I told her Matthew was cautious and seemed obsessed with taking everything from me. I didn't want to make things worse. But with no other options, we headed to my mansion. I tried to open the door with my key, but it was futile, the lock had been changed. Tears streamed down my face as I realized Matthew had already decided this house wasn't mine anymore, even though we had bought it together. Suddenly, Andrea appeared, wearing only Matthew's shirt, her hair disheveled. She cried out in surprise, asking what we were doing there. Feeling humiliated and betrayed, I shouted at Andrea, asking how she could do this. I had shared all my secrets with her, and this was how she betrayed me. Matthew came out frowning. He asked what we wanted, saying he wasn't expecting guests. He told Andrea not to worry and told us to leave, saying he'd see us in court. Choking on the audacity of it all, I cried out that this was my house too. I asked how he could be here with his mistress when we were still married, and how he could do this when I had loved him. Janet intervened, introducing herself as my lawyer who would defend my interests in court. She asked if we could come in, saying we needed to talk before the trial. Matthew laughed and let us in, asking what could be so important. He confidently stated that Bruce wouldn't give us a chance. Janet calmly asked Matthew why he was divorcing me and why he wouldn't divide things fairly. She pointed out he could afford to pay me half and that he wasn't poor. Angry, Matthew demanded to know why she was asking so many questions. He declared his love for Andrea and said they were having a baby, something I could never do. He asked where he was supposed to live with his new family. Andrea was glowing, showing no shame for destroying a family and hurting her childhood friend. She had always solved problems through the bedroom, and this scheme had never failed her. She didn't care that I was suffering. No one had loved Andrea as a child, so she had no sympathy for anyone. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out the test results from my bag and threw them in Matthew's face. I asked him what he was talking about, having a baby. I reminded him that he had read the test results himself. He was infertile and couldn't have children. So the question was, who had gotten Andrea pregnant? With shaking hands, Matthew replied that I must be lying. He insisted the test results had to be fake, saying Andrea wouldn't betray him like that. Janet then responded coldly, her words hanging in the air as we all waited to see what would happen next. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, and a strange sense of vindication. The truth was finally coming out, but at what cost? Janet calmly suggested that it would be easy to verify the truth. She told Matthew he could call the clinic himself or get retested. She revealed that Andrea had deceived him and said she had evidence. Janet showed us a photo, explaining that Andrea was enjoying herself with a young man twice a week. She asked Matthew how he felt about this news and suggested it would make quite a scandal if we talked about it all in court and invited the press. She questioned whether his business reputation would survive such exposure. Matthew was stunned. He waved the photos in front of Andrea, demanding to know if it was true. He yelled that it was too late for lies. Desperate, Andrea confessed. She apologized to Matthew, admitting she wasn't pregnant. She claimed she truly loved him and that she had lied about the pregnancy because she knew he wouldn't have decided to leave his wife otherwise. Andrea tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't such a big deal and that they were doing so well together. Furious, Matthew pushed Andrea away. He screamed at her to get out of his house and his life, saying he never wanted to see her again. He blamed her for ruining his family and said he hated her. Matthew collapsed into a chair, covering his head with his arms. I could see all his dreams of children and a new family slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was so dejected and ashamed in front of me that he couldn't even lift his face. I imagined he felt like he'd been dragged through the mud. In a hoarse voice, he said he wouldn't take the house and that we should follow the law. He asked everyone to leave, saying he wanted to be alone. Janet looked satisfied and led me out, as I was unable to speak. I was shaking, feeling like I'd been stirring dirty laundry and wanting to wash it all away and forget everything. Suddenly, Janet suggested I come to her place. She offered to introduce me to her brother and said I could stay with them until things settled down. She reminded me that I had mentioned money problems and pointed out that I wouldn't need to spend the rest of my money on a hotel. I gratefully accepted her offer. I told her I wanted to stay there for a while because I didn't want to be alone. I admitted that bad thoughts were creeping in, even thoughts of not wanting to live. I explained that I had thought I had a strong family, a loving husband, and would have had children. I had wanted to grow old with Matthew. The realization that everyone had been deceiving me, my husband and best friend, day after day, was terrifying. I told Janet that thinking about it made me feel like I was going crazy 24 hours a day. But she said that if I came as a guest, it would at least distract me. I knew I needed to find a job to learn how to live on my own, as I no longer had anyone I could trust. Janet lived in a small, cozy apartment with her brother, Joshua. We had time to unpack and prepare dinner before he came home from work. When Joshua saw me, he smiled. He greeted us, surprised to see a guest. He playfully scolded Janet for not telling him, saying he would have brought something nice. Joshua introduced himself and guessed that I must be a colleague of his sister's. I blushed deeply. This simple, friendly man was very handsome. I introduced myself as Lexi and explained that I wasn't a colleague, but a homeless client. I told him Janet had suggested I stay there for a while and asked if he'd mind me being there, not wanting to be a bother. Joshua waved his hand dismissively. He welcomed me warmly and said he'd be happy to paint my portrait. I nodded and sat down for dinner. Curious, I asked Joshua if he was an artist, commenting on how interesting that profession was. I asked if I could see his work. Joshua replied shyly, explaining that it was more of a hobby. He told me he had been attending painting classes since childhood and that his works had been exhibited in major contests. He had dreamed of going to art school, but his parents objected, saying it wasn't a serious profession for a man. They had insisted he go to a mechanical engineering college, and now he worked as an engineer. Joshua admitted he hated his job and that it wasn't easy with his leg problem. He explained that he and his sister didn't live very richly, as they were saving money for treatment. He said it was a long story that he didn't want to talk about much. After dinner, Joshua showed me his paintings, which impressed me greatly. They were very honest and sincere, and his talent was obvious. I learned that Joshua earned quite a bit of money painting landscapes and portraits of passers-by in the park on weekends. I quickly became friends with Joshua, and he decided to tell me about his difficult life. He described his sister and parents as good people. His father was a designer, and his mother worked in a design office all her life. They were an intellectual family who rarely fought but were greatly influenced by others' opinions. Joshua painted a picture of a home always kept in exemplary order, with starched napkins and spotless white tulle on the windows. He couldn't remember ever seeing dust. Sometimes his father's colleagues would visit, and it would be like a showcase evening. Everyone would eat and drink, and his parents would praise him and his sister, expecting them to meet the standards of perfect children. Joshua revealed that he was born with a hip subluxation. His mother had tried to remove this defect when he was still a baby but couldn't completely succeed. The silly crab-like walk and regular deterioration had haunted him all his life. He felt his parents were a little ashamed to show him to guests, so they tried to emphasize his good grades at school. They would show off his diplomas. At school, Joshua was bullied, being called a robot or disabled. He grew up quiet and introverted, not liking people except for his sister. He had no friends. Painting was and still is his escape. In the process, he forgets everything, and his soul feels at ease. At art school, no one paid attention to his illness. Only creativity was valued there. There, he felt like he could spread his wings and fly. He often asked his parents to let him study more in this direction, but it was no use. As I listened to Joshua's story, I felt a deep connection forming between us. Two wounded souls, finding solace in each other's company. I wondered what twists of fate had brought us together in this moment, and what the future might hold. I listened intently as Joshua continued his story, his voice tinged with sadness. He explained that people would think art wasn't a serious profession and that being an engineer was what a real man should do. Joshua confessed that he suffered every day at the factory, comparing getting up for work to facing a firing squad. He admitted it wasn't suited for him. Surprised by his revelation, I couldn't help but ask why he continued to endure a job he disliked, especially since he'd been an adult for so long. I suggested he pursue something creative, pointing out his obvious talent. I wondered aloud if he still feared his parents' judgment, telling him it seemed foolish to let life pass him by. Joshua's face fell as he considered my words. He explained that he felt he had no choice. The income from painting in the park wasn't enough to live on, let alone pay for the expensive joint replacement surgery he needed. He spoke of needing training or at least connections, mentioning how many artists were self-taught but unknown. Joshua revealed that without the surgery, he couldn't even think about having a family. He confessed to being tired of being alone, wanting a woman to love and children of his own. He didn't want to be a burden on his sister Janet, who worried about him and saved money for his treatment. Joshua's voice cracked as he shared how his condition made him feel invisible to others. He mentioned a brief romantic relationship where the woman only used him in public and was ashamed of him. He'd given up trying to meet someone, unable to bear the pitying, condescending looks from women. His paintings, he said, were for his soul. I couldn't contain myself any longer. "What are you saying, Joshua?" I exclaimed, my heart aching for him. I told him that when I first saw him, I hadn't even noticed the way he walked. Instead, I'd been drawn to his smile and open attitude, finding him sociable and genuine. I asked if he thought all women were the same, reminding him that we're all different. I assured him that he'd meet the right woman for him, feeling certain of it. Then an idea struck me. "Can I put your work on the internet?" I asked excitedly. I suggested creating a website or posting photos on social media, assuring him there was no risk. My enthusiasm growing, I asked if I could go to the park with him, eager to see how he created his art. Joshua's face lit up with a smile as he agreed. He offered to paint my portrait and admitted he'd never considered using the internet, but saw no harm in trying. Then, to my surprise, he added softly, "Lexi, your husband is a fool. To lose a woman like you. I would cherish you so much." His words sent a flutter through my heart, but I pushed the feeling aside, reminding myself of my recent heartbreak. As days passed, I found myself growing surprisingly comfortable in Janet and Joshua's cozy home. Matthew called frequently, but I refused his calls and eventually blocked his number. After his betrayal, I was content to wait for the trial, hoping to receive a fair share of our house. I found myself thinking about using that money to help with Joshua's surgery. I felt confident I could find a job and a place to live. Meanwhile, I imagined Matthew was angry, frustrated by his inability to reach me. I thought about how he had ignored me while he was with Andrea, and now he was experiencing the pain of being ignored himself. I wondered if he was reflecting on his mistakes, questioning whether breaking up our family had been worth it. In my mind's eye, I could see Matthew drinking cognac, filled with regret. I imagined him asking himself what he had missed, the spark and passion in bed. He might be realizing that life with me hadn't been as boring as he'd thought, but now everything was ruined. I pictured him alone in our house, with no one to wake him with a gentle kiss or call him for breakfast, no one to whisper words of love. Was this the life he had dreamed of? I wondered if he regretted hurting me so deeply, if he felt he needed to make things right and apologize. Perhaps he hoped I might change my mind and come back. After all, I had loved him faithfully for years. He might be willing to do anything to return to the way things were before. On the day of the trial, I prepared carefully. I was nervous, but determined to look my best. To my surprise, everything went smoothly. We divorced, and I received a good amount for the house and assets. As I left the courthouse, I found Matthew waiting on the porch. He hesitantly touched my hand, his voice soft and pleading. Matthew told me I looked beautiful, begging for forgiveness. He admitted he had been a fool to start all this, expressing remorse for his affair with Andrea. He said he truly wanted to reconciliate, asking me to come back. He reminded me of our years together, insisting he had realized how much he loved me and promising never to cheat again. I could see Matthew wasn't lying, and I appreciated his sincerity. But I sighed, my heart heavy as I replied, "No, I won't come back." I told him I had loved him more than life itself and had believed in him until the end. I expressed how terrible it was to know they had been secretly betraying me for over a year, lying to me every day. I admitted I could never understand how they could do that. I explained that things could never be the same, that it hurt to see him and remember everything. I told him I couldn't live in our house knowing he had slept there with Andrea. "You ruined everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I asked him to part ways peacefully, to stop calling and not to look for me. I wished him luck, saying goodbye, and hoping we'd never meet again. With a heavy heart, I went to Janet's house and cried until nightfall. In my mind, I flipped through each episode of my life with Matthew like pages in a book, tearing them out one by one. Janet and her brother understood, not disturbing me. But I overheard Joshua expressing his concern to Janet in a hushed voice. He wondered if I still loved my ex-husband very much, if he had any chance with me at all. He said he felt sorry for me and wanted to help. Janet sighed, acknowledging that I had spent half my life with Matthew and couldn't forget him immediately. She said I needed help to overcome this pain, that time would heal everything. She assured Joshua I would calm down soon, advising him to just be there for me and let time tell. Then Janet mentioned an idea she had for me. She suggested opening their own law firm, with me as her assistant since I was very capable even though I wasn't a lawyer. She offered to teach me how to prepare documents, saying she felt comfortable with me and trusted me. Joshua's response was enthusiastic. He was happy at the prospect of seeing me more often, admitting he thought he had fallen completely in love with me. The next morning, after crying all night, I had made a decision. I emerged for breakfast and handed Joshua a wad of bills. As I did so, I felt a mix of emotions. I felt hope for a new beginning, gratitude for the kindness of these new friends, and a tentative flutter of something that might, in time, grow into love. I told him to go to the hospital tomorrow and make an appointment for the surgery. With a sad smile, I explained that money hadn't brought me happiness, so it should be used for something good. I thanked them for their kindness but said I couldn't stay forever. I mentioned I had addresses for some companies and planned to go for interviews and find a place to live. Joshua and Janet were stunned, their faces a picture of disbelief and gratitude. They hugged me tightly, their warmth enveloping me. Janet promised they'd pay me back once Joshua recovered, explaining they had some savings of their own. She asked me to wait and listen to their job proposal. As Janet outlined her idea to open a law firm, I felt a spark of interest ignite within me. I admitted it might be worth trying, complimenting Janet on her intelligence. I suggested we should start, acknowledging we might not have as many clients as Bruce at first, but emphasizing the importance of beginning. I proposed charging lower fees and competing based on results. With a lump in my throat, I told them that thanks to them, I could start a wonderful new life. Joshua's surgery was a success, and I stayed by his side throughout his recovery. We took our first steps together, becoming close friends through this challenging time. There were moments of hysteria, tears of pain and happiness, and it was deeply moving when he took his first steady steps. I found myself falling in love with Joshua naturally, a stark contrast to my love for Matthew. With Matthew, it had felt like self-sacrifice, always trying to please him while he took my feelings for granted. With Joshua, it was different, we were ourselves, with all our strengths and weaknesses. There was no shame or fear of appearing ridiculous, loving each other wholeheartedly came easily. We constantly wanted to create and smile together. After Joshua's full recovery, Janet and I started our business, quickly gaining our first clients. Joshua made a life-changing decision, quitting his engineering job to focus on his creativity. We bought a house together, ensuring Joshua had his own studio. The artwork I posted online for Joshua became a huge success. Patrons showed interest, and we organized an exhibition that turned out to be a triumph. Joshua began to believe in himself and create more freely. Our relationship blossomed into a passionate romance, free from conventions and obligations, we were simply in love. Meanwhile, I heard that Matthew's business was deteriorating rapidly. He had to sell the clothing factory, unable to cope with the situation without my help. Unable to pay employees' salaries, the company declared bankruptcy. He sold the house and moved to another town, far from bad memories. But even there, he couldn't find peace. His conscience burned, and he desperately missed someone, not Andrea, but me. I appeared frequently in his dreams, but Matthew would wake up alone in an unfamiliar room, broken and angry. He tried to find a woman like me but failed. One day, while walking in the park with Joshua, I noticed him repeatedly looking at a portrait of a small, skinny boy. Curious, I asked Joshua who the child was and if he was drawing from memory. Joshua answered in a small voice, telling me about David, a boy he'd met in the park long ago. He explained that David came from a dysfunctional family, and they often talked. Joshua would buy him tea and bread or ice cream, sometimes giving him money. He hadn't seen David since he was discharged from the hospital. Worried, I exclaimed, asking why he hadn't told me before and insisting we needed to find David. I asked where he lived, but Joshua frowned, admitting he didn't know. He'd never asked for David's full name or address, not wanting to scare him. Joshua described David as being like a frightened kitten. Determined, I made a suggestion, my mind already formulating a plan to help this child we'd never met. As I looked at Joshua, I saw the same determination in his eyes, and I knew that together, we could make a difference in David's life, just as we had in each other's. I suggested we take the portrait to the park and ask the vendors and passers-by if they had seen David coming regularly. My heart raced with hope and determination as we set out on our mission. As we circled the area asking questions, a ticket seller at the amusement park recognized him. He told us that David used to come there often, wanting to ride but never having money. The man said David lived in a rundown house with a green roof nearby, scheduled for demolition. He mentioned David's mother neglected him, drinking and bringing men home. The ticket seller hadn't seen David recently, which made my stomach churn with worry. Joshua and I hurried to the address, our concern growing with each step. The house was in terrible condition, and my heart sank at the sight. We called out and shouted, but there was no answer. Just as despair was setting in, a neighbor finally came out, drawn by the commotion. The neighbor informed us that David's mother had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital and lost custody. David had been sent to an orphanage, and I felt a mix of relief and sadness wash over me. Joshua murmured that we needed to help poor David. He suggested we take him with us, assuring me I'd like David as he's quiet, calm, and smart. Joshua couldn't bear to leave him in trouble, and I felt the same way. I nodded, sharing that I'd always dreamed of having children, but it seemed fate had other plans for me. I declared I'd become David's mom and give him all the warmth and love he deserved. We agreed to go to the orphanage and sort everything out. It took a long time to convince the director, explaining our serious intentions. We promised to marry soon and take the child. The woman saw we were good people and understood the child needed a family. When David saw Joshua, he lit up, cried and leaped into his arms. David called Joshua uncle and asked if he'd come looking for him. He said he'd been waiting, that it wasn't good there and his mother was sick. David begged Joshua to take him away, then noticed me and asked if I was Joshua's wife. I smiled and gently stroked his head. I introduced myself as Lexi and expressed my desire to be his second mom if he'd allow it. I told him I'd always dreamed of having such a wonderful son and asked if he'd like to live with us as a family. I promised to love him and never let anyone hurt him. David nodded, rubbed his eyes, and agreed. He promised to be obedient and helpful, saying he'd do everything on his own. 3 months later, we officially adopted David, and he moved in with Joshua and me. To our delight, the three of us got along wonderfully, adjusting to each other and enjoying our respective happiness. David found responsible, loving parents, and we found a son. We now enjoy going to the park together, with Joshua teaching David to paint or watching cartoons and laughing together. A year later, an even greater happiness arrived that words couldn't express. I found out I was pregnant, a miracle I never thought possible. One day, we received news about Andrea. The doctor told us she would be in the hospital for a long time. Apparently, a man had left her for another woman, and Andrea had tried to kill him, throwing a knife and seriously injuring him. They had tried to put her in prison, but it became clear she was completely insane. The doctor described Andrea as aggressive and obsessed with thoughts of murder, with no prospects for recovery. I asked if she would ever recover, but the doctor shook his head. He said it seemed unlikely, that the case was quite serious. The doctor explained that all that awaited Andrea was either their hospital or a mental institution. I felt no sympathy for Andrea, reflecting on the wisdom of life. Everyone gets what they deserve. My son and I returned home where Joshua was waiting. He had prepared spaghetti with cheese and greeted us with a warm embrace. Joshua expressed how much he'd missed us and invited us to the table. He asked our son if he was okay and if he'd met his mom. The boy hugged me tightly and answered with serious eyes that now I could be his real mom. He said he wouldn't see that other mom anymore and that he loved me very much. I held the boy close, whispering through happy tears that he was our son, our only son, and that Daddy and I loved him very much. My soul felt light and good. Now I truly have a strong family, my loving husband Joshua, our son David, and soon, our daughter, who is on the way. As I looked at my family gathered around the dinner table, I marveled at how life had brought us together. I thought about the twists and turns that had led me to this moment of pure joy and contentment. My journey had been filled with pain and heartbreak, but it had also led me to a love and happiness I never thought possible. I silently thanked the universe for this second chance at life and love, grateful for every moment with my new family. As I looked around at my family, I couldn't help but think, isn't this what true happiness is? I felt no regret about divorcing Matthew. Our marriage had been a mistake from the start, but we'd both realized it too late. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I could see how ill-suited we'd been for each other. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me for the twists of fate that had brought me here. Meeting Janet had been the turning point, the start of a new, different, and authentic life. I thought about how different things might have been if I'd stayed with Matthew, trapped in a loveless marriage, never knowing the joy I now feel every day. The pain of his betrayal had been excruciating, but it had also been the catalyst for change. I silently thanked the universe for giving me the strength to walk away and the courage to start anew. As I watched Joshua playing with David, I marveled at the depth of love I felt for them both. This was the family I'd always dreamed of but never thought I'd have. And with our daughter on the way, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. I placed a hand on my growing belly, feeling a flutter of movement. Life had taken me on an unexpected journey, but I wouldn't change a single step. This, I thought, is where I was always meant to be.